This is Joe Mullings with The Other Side. Today I've got Mark Leahey. Mark is the president and CEO of Medical Device Manufacturers Association, joining us from Washington, D.C. MDMA is an organization that is an incredibly powerful organization and I think critical to the success of the medical device world. So first of all, thanks for joining us today.
Joe, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Could you explain to our audience a little bit about MDMA and their role, both wartime as well as regular time for us?
No, absolutely. MDMA represents about 300, primarily small to mid-sized venture-backed medtech companies. It was founded back in 1992 by a handful of entrepreneurs who felt that, there wasn't that kind of pure voice for small to mid-sized medtech companies in DC. So fast forward to today, from that handful of medtech companies, again, about 300 companies all together. I've had the great pleasure of working with MDMA for over 18 years. And we work with Johnson & Johnson and Boston Scientific and Abbott, some of the larger players. But our DNA are really those small to mid-sized companies. And we try to be their eyes and ears in DC. They don't have, large companies have usually more resources at disposal, standalone lobbyists that may make it cost prohibitive for small to mid-sized companies, but collectively pool the resources together, and we give them, I think, A+ advocacy and educational assistance to help navigate the FDA, CMS, and obviously in these times of crisis. We thought, obviously looking at the end of the year, when we repealed the medical device tax, that was a 10-year journey that we led from the outset, and thought that, okay, we can finally start to play a little offense here. And then obviously things changed dramatically with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been all hands on deck to try to make sure that we're being proactive so that we can not only help those in the front line and patients and caregivers through this, but also, a number of our small to mid-sized companies, if you're in the elective procedure space, from a business standpoint, they're at the front lines of innovation. As you know, most of the innovations are driven by small companies, and the impact and their ability to sustain during these uncertain times is a paramount focus for us as well.
Yeah, and you and I have been going back and forth for the last 2 weeks. You've been incredibly busy on behalf of the small to mid-sized entrepreneurs and medical device manufacturers on the Hill. And I know you were intimately involved in the CARES Act, which was the major legislative feat with over $2 trillion in funding. Can you tell me about some of those, programs, policies that were designed in particular to help this med tech system and the ecosystem, and then again, the large healthcare delivery system in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first and foremost, it was critical. There was $150 billion put in there for the hospitals, the first responders, to make sure that they have additionally for surge, ability for surge capacity, for additional PPE, ventilators, et cetera, and that liquidity, obviously, to continue operations, given that, much of this is in preparation. So obviously that was a key element of the package to help hospitals. When you look further into the provisions, there are also a number of different mechanisms that will help businesses adversely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic to help during these uncertain times. And I would agree with policymakers. This isn't a stimulus package. This is relief. This isn't about juicing the economy. This is about how do you provide liquidity to sustain entities in which effectively the revenue stream is shut off. And, again, rightly so, CMS issued a directive of federal guidance deferring all elective procedures until further notice. And I think initially that's a function of the lack of PPE. They didn't want gowns and masks and gloves to be using for elective procedures, save those for the expectation of the COVID-19 surge. But I think, again, fortunately, we're ramping up on PPE, but in the not too distant future, we're going to see the capacity in hospital beds, not just in New York, but across the country, requiring all hands on deck, and maybe some of the ASC sites repurposing anesthesia devices for ventilators and others. So, there's going to be, I think, for the next 2 to 3 months, a disruption in the ability for patients to get access to things that are deemed non-essential. And obviously for companies who help patients in those particular areas, there's a need for some assistance. And the CARES Act had two kind of main pipes for liquidity. One is the expansion of SBA's 7A program. This is intended for small businesses. And again, the NCAS code for small businesses for medical devices. If you're a medical instrument manufacturer, that means a company under 1,000 employees. For some of the imaging folks, that's 1,250 employees. And this is effectively a loan intended to cover your salaries, overhead for rent, mortgage, interest on debt for an 8-week period so that you can continue to keep the workforce engaged. And at the end of the period, if you maintain your workforce, that loan will be forgiven. And that's a loan up to about $10 million. There's a calculation that needs to take place to see how much you qualify for. I will say one of the challenges we're dealing with, and this impacts a lot of med tech companies and our members, there is an Arcane affiliate rule, which I'm not going to go into here, but effectively, if you're a venture-backed medical device company, the way they calculate your employee total is not just on your company, but they look at the venture firms that invest in you, and they look at not just their employees, but all the employees from all their portfolio companies, whether they're med tech or not. And so you can see pretty quickly you'd exceed that employee threshold. And so we've been actively engaged with the SBA, with the Treasury Department, with the Hill. Yesterday, Treasury issued some preliminary guidance on this program, on this initiative, and said additional guidance may be forthcoming related to the affiliate rule. And then the other element here, the 4-page application just came out. The second page has a certification that states any entity that is more of a 20% holder in a company has to certify that the funds will only be used for the purposes intended under the loan. And as you can imagine, most of the equity investors don't have the day-to-day control of expenses, and so holding them federally liable under criminal prosecution, that's the limitation. So again, these are things and I'm sorry, we've been trying to do this interview for, like I said, a couple weeks now, but these things have been popping up, and just was on the phone with someone a couple hours ago involved in this, and so we're hoping that Treasury will provide that clarity, because that's an important, those are important elements to make sure this program works for everybody. And then the other element, the other pipe here is under Title IV, and much of the attention is focused on the airlines and the hotels and some of these big restructuring and bailouts or investments. But you go further down the line, and the one we're really keeping our eye on is called the Main Street Business Lending Program. And this is something that that Treasury, with the backing of the Fed, is set up. Again, the money was appropriated about $450 billion in the CARES Act, but with the Fed providing their leverage capacity, it could actually get up to about $4 to $5 trillion that can be loaned out to small to mid-sized companies. And again, broad strokes here in the legislation, it's going to be a low-interest loan, probably sub 2%, unsecured loan as well. And we're just providing guidance to the Treasury, again, to make sure that there's an easy way you can qualify this, either based upon lost revenues or what your operating expenses have been in the trailing 3 months and look forward. But critical to this, too, to make sure it works for folks, is making sure that any loan provided will be deemed as subordinate to any existing debt covenants or fall outside of those existing debt covenants, or also not trigger any sort of risk profile, because all these programs, and again, to the Congress's credit, are going to be run through existing banks and existing relationships that companies have. So, that's the positive to get these things through. But what we don't want to have happen is, all right, you get this loan, and the same lender who you're working through this says, well, your risk exposure is higher, so we're going to jack the interest rate up 2.5 points on your exit. So again, not to get in the weeds here, but there are good programs in place. Our job right now is taking the collective feedback of our member companies to make sure that these are done in a timely way, get the liquidity out under terms that allow for that float, in the hopes that we get back to more regular environment in the next 3 to 4 months.
Yeah, and I'm thankful, and I know our industry's thankful, because it's these nuances and these details that you can fill out this paperwork, you can get in line, you can do everything above board, but there's this one little trigger that would omit you from possibly getting the supply you need. And like you called it, this is not a stimulus, this is a relief and there's a whole stimulus need on the other side of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know you also MDMA works very, very closely with the FDA. And you mentioned earlier PPE. We've obviously got the ventilator issue, the bed issue, and masks, and other products in the supply chain that keep our frontline people safe. And that's critically important, because if they're not there, the patient care is not there, and the balance of patient care. What are you doing with the FDA in order to fast track that? Certainly not negotiate away patient safety, but make decisions and expedite things.
This is a great question, and I have to give tremendous credit to Dr. Shuren, Dr. Maisel, and the entire team at CDRH, and Dr. Hahn as the FDA commissioner. Their, I think, proactive approach on the emergency use authorization to make sure that if there are products that can address the current crisis, they're working very proactively, very creatively. A couple examples I can share with you. There are companies who make ventilators for pediatrics. And I got a call about 2 weeks ago saying, listen, I think, if we can re-engineer this, put more flow in this, in about 2 to 4 weeks, we can ramp up and get manufacturing up. And if they think there's a need, and I said, well, the first thing you should do is, make sure you talk with your engineers to make sure this actually comes to fruition, but then go and, talk to the branch chief at FDA in charge of these products and have that conversation. And I just got, so that process took place. About a week later, I got an email back. This is great. They said, here's the steps forward on the EUA, and so they're moving forward in that regard. Another great example, we work with, we have a lot of great companies. I'm not trying to choose favorites here, but a company, Massimo, that Joe Chiani is the CEO, is on our board. And, Joe makes a pulse oximeter and does blood oxygenation and monitoring and a number of other vital signs. They've been working on a home monitoring device for a period of time. And again, we're working quickly now and just got clearance, I think, last week. And basically, it's a sensor that goes on the tip of the finger and through a Bluetooth signal puts all your vitals onto your iPhone. And then that gets mapped to a hospital where all the information can be tracked. And so you think about what we have coming on us with this unfortunate surge that's likely to come on the horizon here. And if you have a technology like this device that when someone presents at a hospital, you can immediately monitor them and have the vitals that would be as good as if they were in the hospital, all being done remotely, and maybe triage them to another secondary facility. It says, okay, we're going to keep you here until you present, and at a certain time, if your symptoms are severe, or those vitals or that pulse, that blood oxygen level drops to a certain amount, the alarm goes off and says, come here, we need to trigger you and actually admit you or take you to the ICU. Again, these are the types of technologies that FDA and innovators are working collaboratively on to address the situation that, again, if we can't manufacture enough physical beds, how do we leverage technology and these capabilities to still allow high quality patient care, as you said, not lowering the bar at all, but just finding creative ways to adapt to the surge that unfortunately is on the horizon.
You bring up telehealth, and I've been at this for 3 decades, and I've been one of the champions as well as you with knowing that this telehealth is a gateway for better patient care and actually taking some of the cognitive load off of the docs, the surgeons, and all the caregivers. And over the last week, we've had In Touch on, Proximy, Vocalis, Early Sense, all these digitally empowering companies that I always thought we were going to have to wait a generation to declare themselves. But it looks like this may change the game, and we saw that in Massachusetts, the very first state to move for a telehealth consult in order to facilitate that with this COVID crisis. Thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think in our space, in our industry with technology, there have been the capabilities for some time, and it's been nothing in Washington usually happens quickly, but all of a sudden the acute needs here, I think maybe making people recognize that there are ways to leverage this, not only in a more efficient way. Again, you look at healthcare, 70% of our spend is on labor. And so if you can find ways to use technology to more effectively deploy that labor, we're going to take costs out of the system. And quite frankly, it's something that I think most patients, particularly earlier or even the boomers now, people have become comfortable with technology. And so there's a way to leverage this, I think, well beyond this current crisis. So I think, right, the converse is true when you look at just general retail. The brick and mortar retail, I think, has kind of, there was a slow erosion there, and this probably accelerated the demise of the brick and mortar retailer. But on the other side here, I think it's really accelerated and driven a lot of the telehealth and the technology-driven healthcare solutions that, again, are going to provide more access to folks, a better chance on enhancing outcomes, and do so in a much more cost-effective way.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I know your members of the MDMA are doing their best to build these ventilators, build these beds, build these test systems. Abbott comes out with a magnificent system, and I'm hoping it's as promising as we expect it to be. But we're not a supply chain company set up. We have this innovation come up, but we're not really built to be a supply chain very quickly. Is the government working with MDA and MDMA working with the government on the supply side to get these things out? What's happening there?
Absolutely. We have been in close contact with the Vice President's task force over the past few weeks and sharing kind of individual issues. I'll share one with supply chain. We had a company who had 40 million gloves in a port that was basically being held up for some minor technical issues, almost was going to be sent back to Malaysia. And so again, elevating these types of issues to the task force. Customers were able to get involved, and these gloves didn't get shipped back or destroyed. 40 million gloves were available immediately. So they've kind of been these more one-off exercises. I think FEMA over the last week is trying to scale up more capabilities to really map out the needs and the capabilities. For our companies, for example, we've got great companies who have PPE and other masks that they use from kind of the R&D side that they are donating to hospitals in local areas that need them. They're retooling to see if they, to make masks, face shields, others. So, and our other companies as well, when you have technologies right now, and as we just described, when the elective side is scaling down, companies are reaching out saying, listen, we have FDA compliant manufacturing capabilities. We think we can help out and ramp up production in some of these areas. So it really is, it's been extraordinary to see the outpouring of people willing to engage and kind of this all hands approach. And so it's working very closely with FEMA, and there are other, platforms we're assisting with as well. There's a COVID Health Network.com, I believe it is. We'll get the exact website just about to stand up, in the next 24 hours. This is MDMA working with the National Governors Association, and Massimo, the Patient Safety Network, and others to try to find and work with local state entities when there are needs, find where there are capabilities. Also, there are a number of folks in as you know, in the apparel industry who are trying to see if they can help out. And while maybe they don't have the capability to make medical grade masks, I'm sure we've talked about this. I think Dr. Scott Gottlieb has kind of been in the forefront of this pandemic from day one. And if, just looking at his program or proposal over the weekend about that 4-step approach, how do we unwind and get our arms around this? One of the next things that will likely come about when we start to ease the social distancing is a recommendation, I suspect, from the CDC about people wearing face masks. Again, not surgical masks, they're still in need, but a mask that could either, help those who may be asymptomatic from transmitting it, or also for those who don't have it, again, just the reminder not to touch your mouth or your nose during time. So again, I think there's just a lot of interest in people within the medtech community and externally making sure that everyone's doing all they can to help in this unique time.
Earlier you talked about team players, and I think that's one of the really cool things about medtech is everybody's a team player in this. And you mentioned CMS earlier. What has CMS been doing, and what has their role been as we've gone through this? How have they facilitated things and empowered solving some of the problems that otherwise would have been in our way?
Yeah, I think CMS has done an extraordinary job. Obviously, Administrator Verma, very capable and very involved in a number of areas, from making sure that anyone who needed the COVID-19 diagnostic had access to it. It was no out-of-pocket expenses. It was covered. Again, making sure they made an announcement a couple of days ago that they'd be sending payments out to providers regardless of procedures, to make sure there's liquidity out there. Again, if you're a hospital right now preparing for this, you don't have a lot of elective procedures being delayed. Some of your revenue stream is obviously not coming through. So making sure the liquidity is there for those hospitals who are doing the right thing, deferring elective procedures, ready for that surge. And also, as we just discussed on the telehealth side, a lot of proactive actions to make sure that don't let kind of the bureaucratic ways that things had been done related to how things are covered or reimbursed or paid for get in the way of having the most effective delivery system in place to treat those in need. So I think there's a tremendous amount of credit that Administrator Verma and her team at CMS deserve for making sure that that people who need healthcare have it. They've also moved forward with some Medicaid waivers as well. So just, I think the speed at which they are moving forward, and I would say FDA, CMS, HHS, the White House, this is truly a situation where if they see something that is impeding the ability for patients or people in the front line to have the tools they need, they are doing everything within their power to knock down those barriers.
And that sets me up for a really easy question for you. As the head of MDMA and being a major champion of everybody in the medical device industry, what's been your biggest surprise to date, both positive and negative?
I think I'll start with, maybe it was a negative and it turned into a positive. I think just the dynamics associated with how each state has handled the way in which how their citizens will be able to move about and some of the lockdowns that took place and what constituted an essential employee. Again, this is an area where the Department of Homeland Security put out guidance early on. We were instrumental in making sure that, it's not just the providers, the nurses, the doctors, but, medical technology companies who make the ventilators, the respirators, all these are essential employees as well and employers. And so we're able to get that federal guidance out. But then you had states implementing it, and there were, I'm not going to name which states, but there were certain states that identified medical device manufacturers as essential, but paper manufacturers or metal fabricators as not essential. And so we had instances where ventilator manufacturers need to use a metal fabricator. And so they had issues, but, we were proactively work with our state affiliates, our state partners, and with the governor's offices to, bring these examples forward. Another one happened where a company is making one of the leading diagnostics for one of the branded companies, and they were moving forward the diagnostics, but the paper manufacturer were deemed non-essential, so you couldn't get the label or the instructions for use incorporated. So without all of these pieces together, there were hiccups along in the supply chain. The good news here is that, again, on these early states, it was kind of trial and error because these states were probably the leading ones in trying to put these programs in place. And so it required more of a manual intervention with us working with the governor's office or us working with the senators in that state, then leaning into the governors. But just over the weekend, the Department of Homeland Security updated their guidance, even a broader and more clear definition for the federal guidance. And states, say, Ohio, California updating, a number of other states have subsequently put these appropriate, I think, restrictions on non-essential, have a better definition of essential, because again, that was the calls we're getting, and I joke I'm the plumber. People only call when things get stuck. In the breadth and depth of questions that have arisen under this unique period in time have been wide and varied. But I'd say that, again, our ability to get clarity around these essential employer and employees, not just with the companies too, with folks in their supply chain, is an area that was concerning on the front end, but it shows, I think, through the collective and the efforts and the collaboration with ourselves, the state associations we work with, the governor's office, and the federal government have landed a place where there's more clarity going forward.
That's awesome. I love to hear that, because it's so hard that people don't understand the actual supply chain that goes into getting these products to market and the multiple stakeholders. You just have to go to MDDI show and see that this is a $600 billion a year industry. And until now, it's really been sort of behind the curtain. And people really realizing now what an impact this has at scale, from both an employment around the world, distribution around the world, and obviously keeping people alive.
Absolutely.
You and I have an interesting perspective on this industry. What do you think, on the other side of this, our industry starts to look like an index towards, an index away from?
Again, a lot of this I think will be driven by how the healthcare situation itself works out. I remain optimistic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist, but as you noted, with the increasing and more sophisticated testing capabilities out there, point of care, rapid diagnostics for COVID-19, with some of these serology testing here too to see who has the antibodies. If we can get a therapeutic that looks promising out maybe by the summer. Our hope obviously is that this surge comes in late April, early May. We get through that, and then with advanced testing and some of these other efforts that and with the summer, that things start to get back to a more normal pace. And if that happens, obviously, then I think it's a lot easier for companies to advance. One of the issues we didn't talk about is for these small companies. I talked to a number of companies who were running clinical trials, early feasibility, and these clinical trials were going to be basically the critical piece for a Series A financing. And they were 16. One was 14 patients into a 20-person trial, and then the PI is not allowed into the site anymore. So how do you then do follow-up here in the appropriate time? And so, these are, from our small to mid-sized companies, I think some of the critical issues here. Maybe they're pre-commercial, but they're developing really innovative technologies here. And how do you continue to advance that R&D in this time? I think they're persisting to the extent possible, but again, a lot of this will be driven by the duration of the healthcare situation. But again, I'm optimistic that if we can get things kind of steadying up by mid to late May and June, ramping further down, that July, August, September maybe looks more steady state. And again, with technologies hopefully better equipped to, we'll still have cases in the fall, obviously. That won't abate until we have a vaccine. But again, great news from Johnson & Johnson earlier this week. But if we can at least get a therapeutic that treats patients early signs like with the Tamiflu and prevents that escalation to pneumonia and some of the respiratory distress issues, then I think Q3 and Q4 look a lot different for our industry and for innovators. And that's kind of the bullish, optimistic approach. If for some reason we find ourselves in a different perspective, it's really going to make sure that, again, some of the earlier programs I discussed that the federal government's putting in place, not again stimulus, but just liquidity and relief, that those are extended. Some of the technical challenges I addressed are included because, as I said, the small company is the lifeblood of medical technology innovation here. And they need to make sure that there's the ability to move forward here, keep the teams together, because not only is it, we're the envy of the world when it comes to the innovation, the life-saving technologies, but as you noted, from an economic standpoint, I mean, these are the type of jobs that we want more of, high-tech, high manufacturing jobs here. So again, we just need to make sure we can get through this as quickly as possible, making sure we have the right support for those companies who have some financial distress. And I'm confident we can do those things. Certainly, relative to other industries out there, hotels and travel and others, I can see those taking maybe a longer time, unfortunately, to recover on the other side. But again, there's a lot of pent-up demand already for patients who have elective procedures who are being deferred. And as you know, what constitutes, there's a lot of range in elective procedure as well. And so you don't want to have these things delayed too much, stack up, because the further that they're delayed, maybe there's a more acute intervention that's needed. So again, as we look ahead here, hopefully we get back to a steady state Q3, Q4, and there will be additional legislative vehicles. Some of the things that we're exploring, what policies can we put in place to make sure, again, once we get the all clear or things are better on the healthcare front, that there aren't limitations that impede patients from getting access to the procedures and the medically necessary technologies that their doctors deem, and whether that's ways to relax or eliminate copays or deductibles. Because the last thing we want to have happen is all clear on the health front. People have deferred procedures because of this emergency and then are making a tough decision in Q3 or Q4. Well, I want this, the doctor's able to do it, but I don't have the money to pay out of pocket because, I've been laid off. And so again, these are some of the things we've been laser focused on addressing the frontline needs right now of the healthcare workers and ramping capacity, but we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And part of our job at MDMA is to also look down the field and make sure that we are, again, looking at some additional long-term solutions here that'll make sure patients are getting the access to the technologies and the procedures they need and not be encumbered by any sort of financial limitations that may be lingering as a result of this situation.
Yeah, and it becomes a very complex model downrange. You mentioned venture capital. So, it wasn't even pre-revenue. I have some revenue generating companies that were in the middle of post-market studies, and they were hospital-based. I won't mention who it was, and they had to lay off 50% of their team up in Boston earlier this week. I have another client that's in a multi-billion-dollar elective surgery on the ortho side, had to put a hold on a major sales initiative. So it's not always the companies that are in the A and B pre-approval, pre-clearance round. And then to your point, when the money comes back around or the opportunity comes back around, where's the money going to be to pay for that deductible? So I think it's going to be a very interesting time. Venture's going to be holding on to their money to maybe keep a B and C round investment rather than start up an A, because they want to keep that B and C moving along and healthy to get it on the exit out of the 10 investments they have in their fund. So it's going to become a very complex situation downrange, I think, over the next year for that early stage tech assessment. So it'll be interesting to watch, and I know you'll be at the helm helping with that as well.
You're absolutely right. As you said, they have to feed the kids they have right now and can't afford to have a new one. But again, I think, hopefully things do turn around quickly. And again, I think we discussed it a bit earlier. but with, I think, some of a fresh look on regulatory pathways, on payment pathways. I am bullish that this will actually create opportunities that we didn't appreciate or see the acute need for 6 months ago, but will now be like, hit you like a ton of bricks. How could we not have seen this? And again, the industry has always evolved to meet the needs of the patient, the caregiver, and I remain confident that, again, if we all work together here to make sure patients are served, make sure that we have the necessary support to keep these companies in place as much as possible, we're in a great position to rebound and come out stronger than ever.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Mark, anything you want to close with that I should have asked you and I didn't?
No, I think, again, you really covered great breadth of the issues we're focusing in on. And it's just, can't thank you enough for all that you're doing and keeping this line of communication open, because I think, as people are drinking to a fire hose. Everybody is trying to get as much information as possible. I should note that about a week and a half ago, MDMA stood up a COVID-19 resource page. So it's at medicaldevices.org. The overwhelming majority of it is open to members and non-members. So that is something that we just think, kind of in this time of need, we want to make sure. So there's summaries of the CARES Act, the small business loans, some webinars, and we're just trying to have one-stop shop for what's going on at Capitol Hill, with FEMA, with CMS, with FDA. So again, if folks are looking for a resource to help navigate and get the latest and greatest on information, I just direct them to that web page that web page that we have. That again, most of it is all open source, open facing, so that companies have the tools they need to succeed.
So listen, Mark, I know you're incredibly busy. I am super thankful, and I know our industry super thankful to have somebody as voracious as you representing our organizations up there. And I'm sure you got to get back to work here. I do want you to stay healthy, safe, and I will see you soon, my friend.
Looking forward to it. Thanks again, Joe, and thanks everybody for listening. Hope everyone stays safe as well. Take care.
You bet. This has been Joe Mullings with The Other Side.